The Kravathi Empire prided itself on the cold, calculated efficiency of its Shadowborn assassins. When the Imperial Enforcement Station detected the human vessel, Relentless, drifting silently near Sector 7, they assumed it was another primitive vessel ripe for exploitation. For 73 cycles, humanity had been the galaxy's favorite punching bag, providing labor for asteroid mines and establishing colonies on death worlds like Earth that would melt the skin of most species. Commander Vorath led the boarding team, his mandibles clicking with the rhythmic battle readiness of his warriors. He had spent cycles watching humans do ridiculous things like jumping out of functional aircraft for recreation or ingesting hot sauce poisons just to prove their resilience. But as they entered the bridge of the Relentless, he encountered something he had never seen in his 6 cycles of service. Absolute, terrifying stillness. The humans were not dead. Admiral Marcus Webb sat in his command throne, his face an unreadable mask, his eyes closed, and his breathing deep and steady. Around him, the entire bridge crew was offline, slumped over consoles or reclining in chairs. To the Kravathi, a species that functioned 24 hours a day without ever losing consciousness, this state was indistinguishable from a biological defect or a mass plague. "Is this another human emotional moment?" Vorath hissed, his sensory stalks twitching with disbelief. He had been taught that humans were the biological mistakes of the galaxy, apologizing when stepped on and showing their teeth in bizarre smiles that meant no harm. He signaled for his team to begin waste reclamation of the vessel, assuming the crew had simply ceased to function. But as the Shadowborn moved toward the Admiral, the temperature on the bridge dropped. A low-frequency hum began to vibrate through the deck plates, a frequency that shouldn't have existed in the physical world. A purple iridescent mist began to coil around the Admiral's feet, and the sensors on Vorath's HUD began to scream with massive energy signatures that defied known technology. From the shadows of the bridge, a shape began to manifest. It was 2 kilometers of jagged, iridescent nightmare, with wings the size of a battlecruiser and eyes that burned with a primal, calculating intelligence. It wasn't a ship. It was a biological anomaly pulled directly from the deepest, darkest corners of a human mind. Vorath froze, his feeding tentacles going rigid with primal fear. The human wasn't just offline, he was dreaming. And on a ship full of Death World survivors, a dream was the most dangerous weapon in the universe. The nightmare entity opened its mouth, and instead of fire, it released a pulse of dark energy that made space itself seem to recoil. Vorath realized with a jolt of horror that they hadn't just boarded a ghost ship. They had stepped into the cage of a sleeping god. Vorath's HUD flashed crimson warnings as the iridescent nightmare let out a psychic scream that vibrated in the marrow of his bones. The Shadowborn assassins, legendary for their cold-blooded efficiency and the ability to survive trauma that would drop most species, staggered back in genuine confusion. They were trained to eliminate high-value targets, not the manifested archetypes of ancient human terror. "Neutralize him!" Vorath shrieked, his plasma rifle trembling as he aimed it at the sleeping Admiral. "He is the source. Kill the dreamer and the dream dies." One of the Shadowborn, a veteran named Thra, lunged forward with a combat blade etched in perfect Kravathi script. He aimed for the Admiral's neck, intending to end the primitive life form once and for all. But as the blade entered the coiling purple mist, the metal began to warp and unmake. It didn't break. It simply became less real, its atoms forgetting how to bond in the presence of a mind forged in the crucible of a death world. The nightmare entity, a shifting mass of iridescent scales and calculating intelligence, reached out a semi-solid limb. It didn't strike Thra, it simply touched his helmet. The elite assassin collapsed instantly, his biomonitor flatlining as his mind was overwritten by the sheer neurological pressure of a human REM cycle. "What is this?" Vorath gasped, his secondary stomach churning as he watched his finest warrior fall without a scratch. "This is not war. This is madness." Actually, a new voice interrupted from the communication station. "It's called the Shadow Stage." Vorath spun around to see a young human woman, Lieutenant Jackson, sitting upright in her chair. She wasn't fully awake, her eyes remained closed, and she moved with the eerie, coordinated grace of a predator. "You've heard of our Annoyance protocol, haven't you?" Vorath's sensory stalks drooped in a sign of profound unease. He knew the protocol. If a human says they are getting annoyed, you fix the problem immediately or face the consequences. But no one had ever explained what happens when a human gets annoyed in their sleep. "You see?" Jackson continued, her voice sounding like grinding stone. We spent millennia being hunted on Earth by things bigger and meaner than us. We learned to survive by making bargains with the nightmares in the deep places. If you wake the Admiral now, the projection doesn't go away. It just loses its filter. She turned her head toward the Admiral, whose glowing eyes were now tracking Vorath's every movement with predatory precision. And right now, Jackson whispered, the Admiral is dreaming about the day we lost Colony New Perth. He's dreaming about everything you've ever taken from us. If I were you, I'd stop breathing. The sound of your life support is starting to irritate him. Commander Vorath felt his primary and secondary hearts hammer against his ribs as the atmosphere on the bridge shifted into a toxic, high-pressure soup. His HUD screamed that the nitrogen-oxygen levels were reaching Earth normal, a death world environment that was chemically corrosive to Kravathi biology. The Shadowborn, legendary for their ability to survive things that would drop most species, were now clutching their throats as their redundant organ systems struggled to process the human noise vibrating through the deck. The iridescent nightmare, the Southern Void Dragon, was no longer just a projection. It was beginning to exhibit tactical prescience, countering every move the boarding team made before they even thought to execute it. Every time a Kravathi warrior attempted to raise a plasma rifle, the floor beneath them turned to a localized breakdown of physical laws, causing their weapons to phase through their hands. The humans were still offline, their bodies slumped in a state the galaxy deemed a bioglitch, but their subconscious minds were busy weaponizing the very geometry of the room. "Retreat!" Vorath shrieked, his voice distorted by the thickening air. "Back to the pods. We cannot fight the ghosts of their history." He lunged toward the hatch, but the corridor had changed. It no longer led to the airlock. It stretched into an infinite, recursive loop of the colony streets on New Perth. The world the Kravathi had diplomatically relocated 20 years ago. The walls were no longer steel, but the charred remains of human homes and the sound of distant, hysterical laughter, the kind that meant a brain had finally given up on reality, echoed through the vents. From the shadows of the corridor, more entities emerged. These were the Titans, biomechanical hybrids that looked like supernovas wearing flesh. They didn't use weapons. They simply closed their massive living metal fists, and the structural integrity of the Kravathi boarding pods vanished as if they were made of tissue paper. "You see, Commander," Lieutenant Jackson's voice whispered over the ship's intercom, though she was still visibly asleep in her chair on the bridge. "Humans have stages. Stage 1 is the polite smile. Stage 2 is the warning. Stage 3 is the annoyance. But you've pushed us into the REM cycle. This is where we stop being diplomats and start being the survivors of a world that tried to kill us for 4 billion years. Vorath reached the end of the hall only to find himself back on the bridge, staring into the glowing fusion eyes of Admiral Webb. The Admiral hadn't moved, but his annoyance threshold had been crossed. He wasn't just dreaming of war anymore. He was calculating the logistics of extinction for the entire Kravathi fleet. At the Imperial Enforcement Station, the communications officer, BX, nearly fell out of his seat as the sensor grid erupted in a cacophony of alarms. The 300 energy signatures emerging from the human ship, the Relentless, weren't following the laws of physics. They were biological anomalies, entities that space itself seemed to recoil from on a conceptual level. They moved with tactical prescience, positioning themselves to intercept every escape route before the Kravathi even initiated their retreat. Back on the bridge of the Relentless, Commander Vorath was paralyzed. He watched as Admiral Marcus Webb, the man he had deemed a primitive bioglitch, began to mumble in his deep, unconscious sleep. To the Kravathi, who communicated through a silent, shimmering web of telepathy, the sound of human speech was a physical assault. It wasn't just noise, it was the weaponization of the atmosphere itself. "Target acquired," Webb muttered, his voice a low-frequency vibration that made the station's reinforced bulkheads groan in sympathetic resonance. The iridescent Southern Void Dragon, the manifestation of the Admiral's tactical mind, lunged toward the Imperial station. Every word the sleeping human spoke manifested as a physical shockwave. This was the true Annoyance protocol. For 73 cycles, the galaxy had misinterpreted human patience as weakness, failing to realize that humans were apex predators who simply chose to have table manners. He's not just dreaming, Vorath realized. his feeding tentacles trembling as he watched the station's shields buckle under the weight of a sound. He's conducting a symphony of our destruction. Lieutenant Jackson, her eyes still closed, let out a soft, rhythmic snore. On the tactical display, the sound wave translated into a massive pulse of kinetic energy that converted 6 Kravathi destroyers into constituent atoms and scattered them across the void like cosmic dust. The humans had unified an angry subconsciousness that was currently rewriting the mathematics of conquest in real time. Please! BX's voice crackled over the emergency channel from the station. Commander, whatever you are doing, stop it. The station's life support is failing. The atoms. They are forgetting how to bond. Vorith looked at Admiral Webb. The human's face was no longer a mask of peace. It had hardened into the expression of someone who had buried loved ones until the grave dirt was caked permanently beneath their fingernails. The annoyance threshold had been crossed, and the humans were no longer playing nice. They were becoming the monsters that the galaxy's own hubris had awakened. The human noise had reached a crescendo that the Kravathi Empire's most advanced suppression systems could no longer categorize. On the bridge of the Relentless, reality was not just breaking, it was being systematically rewritten by the subconscious whims of a species forged in the crucible of a Class 12 death world. Commander Vorath, whose legendary Shadowborn assassins were supposed to be the galaxy's most unstoppable killers, stood paralyzed as he watched the unmaking of his entire mission. The iridescent Southern Void Dragon, the manifestation of Admiral Marcus Webb's tactical genius, was no longer a mere shadow. It had become a localized breakdown of fundamental physical laws. It did not destroy ships with conventional weapons. It simply convinced their molecular bonds that they no longer had a reason to exist. Vorath watched in horror as a dreadnought on his tactical screen simply dissolved into a cloud of shimmering metallic dust, as if the ship itself had forgotten its own shape. You still don't understand, do you? Lieutenant Jackson's voice vibrated through the oxygen-rich air. She remained slumped in her chair, her eyes fluttering in the rapid eye movement of a deep, vengeful sleep. You think we're just dreaming. You think this is a biological glitch. But Earth is 4.5 billion years old, Commander. Do you genuinely believe we were the first intelligent species to evolve there? Vorath's sensory stalks quivered with an existential dread that had no translation in the Kravathi tongue. He looked at Admiral Webb. The human wasn't just a soldier, he was a living hard drive, a biological vault containing the echoes of every nightmare that had ever crawled across the surface of Earth. The Annoyance protocol had been surpassed. This was no longer a warning, it was a purging. From the shifting shadows of the bridge, the Titans began to rise. These entities were vaguely humanoid, 300 meters tall, constructed from a living metal that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns. They didn't react to Kravathi plasma fire, they simply stepped through the bolts as if walking through a light rain. With every rhythmic breath the sleeping crew took, the Titans grew more solid, their presence anchoring the nightmare into the physical realm. We unified because we learned that cooperation was more profitable than extinction. Jackson's dreaming voice continued, dropping to a whisper that echoed in Vorath's very mind. But we kept the monsters. We locked them away in our DNA because we feared what they represented. You taught us that the real monsters wear the masks of civilization. You pushed us until we had no choice but to let the old gods out of the basement. Vorath lunged for the communication console, his mandibles clenching so tight they nearly cracked. He had to signal the High Council. He had to tell them to abort the invasion, to flee, to erase every record of the Sol system from their star charts. He needed to tell them that the silence of humanity was not a sign of peace, but a heavy, reinforced door holding back a tide of chaos. Admiral, Vorath shrieked, hoping the physical vibration of his voice would snap the man into consciousness. Wake up! We surrender. Complete, unconditional surrender. The Admiral's mumbling stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was heavier than a neutron star. The iridescent dragon banked with a fluid, terrifying grace. Marcus Webb did not wake up, but he did speak. His voice didn't come from his throat. It radiated from the walls, the floor, and the very air itself. It carried the weight of 3 billion human souls who had once been victims, but were now the architects of a new, terrifying reality. Human justice isn't about vengeance, the Admiral's dreaming voice rumbled, shaking the foundations of the Imperial Station. It's about making sure the galaxy never forgets the cost of its hubris. You wanted to see what lies beneath our skin? You wanted to know why we stay so quiet? Congratulations, Commander. You're about to find out exactly what we see when we close our eyes. Commander Vorath did not scream. He couldn't. His vocal apparatus had been overwritten by the sheer, crushing weight of the 4 billion years of data currently flooding his neural processors. He wasn't just seeing human history, he was experiencing it. He felt the biting cold of the ice ages, the searing heat of ancient volcanic eruptions, and the soul-shattering grief of 1,000 forgotten wars. The human noise was no longer a sound, it was a physical environment. Back at the Kravathi High Command, the situation had shifted from a tactical skirmish to a biological catastrophe. The data link Vorath had used to signal for help had become a two-way bridge. The Annoyance protocol wasn't restricted to the bridge of the Relentless anymore. The Admiral's subconscious, amplified by the ship's experimental Dream Core technology, was using the Kravathi's own telepathic network as a highway. "Sever the connection!" High Counselor Zal thundered, his bioluminescent skin flashing a frantic warning red. "Purge the data stacks! Burn the relays if you have to!" "We can't, Counselor," the lead technician shrieked, his hands dancing across a console that was rapidly turning into something resembling charred bone. "The signal, it's not binary, it's not code, it's an infectious memory. The network is dreaming, sir. The entire Imperial grid is starting to REM cycle." Across the Kravathi Empire on 300 worlds, the lights began to flicker in a rhythmic, pulsing cadence. The exact heartbeat of a sleeping human. Warriors in distant barracks suddenly collapsed, their eyes rolling back as they entered the first sleep their species had known in 10,000 years. But it wasn't a peaceful rest. They were being force-fed the collective trauma of humanity. The monsters under the bed, the fear of the dark, and the relentless, driving need to survive at any cost. On the bridge of the Relentless, Admiral Webb's body remained perfectly still, but the iridescent dragon above him had begun to change. It was shedding its scales, revealing a form made of pure, white-hot information. It wasn't just a nightmare anymore, it was a calculated ghost. Lieutenant Jackson, still trapped in her own deep slumber, let out a dry, hacking cough. The sound echoed through the Kravathi High Council chambers, 8 light-years away, with the force of a sonic boom. "You thought our silence was a lack of power," Jackson's voice whispered through the counselor's own headset, cold and devoid of mercy. "You thought because we didn't broadcast our strength, we didn't have any. But on Earth, the most dangerous things don't growl. They wait. They want you to get close enough to see the color of their eyes." Counselor Zal looked at the main view screen. The Imperial station was no longer visible. It had been swallowed by a sphere of absolute darkness, a void of thought generated by the crew of the Relentless. And from that darkness, something was emerging. Not a ship, not a Titan, but a single massive human hand, composed of 1 billion glowing stars, reaching out toward the heart of the Kravathi Empire. Vorath, still trapped in the Admiral's psychic grip, finally understood the truth. Humans didn't sleep because they were weak. They slept to keep the engine of chaos inside them from burning out the rest of the universe. And the Kravathi had just broken the governor. The High Council chamber of the Kravathi Empire was a place where silence usually meant deep strategic contemplation. Now it was a place where silence meant extinction. High Counselor Zal clutched the edges of his obsidian podium, his vision flickering. The star hand that had emerged from the void was no longer just an image on a screen. It was a physical presence pressing against the outer hull of the Imperial homeworld. The Empire's telepathic network, the very thing that allowed them to coordinate 1,000 worlds in perfect unison, had become their greatest vulnerability. It was the human noise acting as a parasite. Every Kravathi citizen was now experiencing the REM overload. They were seeing things that didn't exist. Giant, hairy predators from Earth's Pleistocene era stalking through high-tech alien laboratories. The smell of rain on hot asphalt. The crushing weight of a human Monday morning. "Counselor," the lead technician gasped, his voice now a ragged, biological sound rather than a telepathic pulse. The Admiral, he's not just dreaming of war anymore. He's dreaming of order. He's subconsciously categorizing us as weeds. On the bridge of the Relentless, the temperature had stabilized, but the atmosphere was now thick with the scent of ozone and old books. Admiral Marcus Webb's breathing had slowed to a rhythmic, heavy thrum. Every time his chest rose, a new sector of the Kravathi Empire went dark. It wasn't that the ships were being destroyed, they were being pruned. They were simply being moved into a pocket of subspace where time didn't exist. A storage locker for the Admiral's subconscious annoyance. This is the 100 billion year calculation. Lieutenant Jackson's voice echoed through the council chamber, her dreaming mind acting as the Admiral's translator. Humans spent millions of years looking at the stars and wondering if we were alone. We hoped for friends, we prepared for enemies, but we never expected to find toddlers playing with matches. The massive star hand began to close. As it did, the physical structure of the Kravathi High Council began to melt. The obsidian pillars turned into towering stalks of Terran oak trees. The holographic displays were replaced by flickering, low-resolution CRT monitors displaying the tactical positions of the entire Kravathi fleet, all marked with a single red X. "We are the Gardeners of the Dark," Jackson whispered, and her voice was joined by the choir of 3 billion ghosts. "We stayed quiet so you could grow. We stayed in our shell so we wouldn't accidentally crush you. But you broke the glass. You woke the gardener before the season was ready." Counselor Zhao looked down at his own hands. They were starting to fade. His very existence was being archived by a sleeping human mind that found his presence to be a distraction. The entire Kravathi hegemony was being deleted from reality because it was making too much noise during a human's afternoon nap. "Please," Zhao choked out, his vocal cords straining against the rewriting of his biology. "What? What must we do?" In the shadows of the chamber, the southern void dragon leaned its massive iridescent head down until its fusion-lit eyes were inches from Zal's face. It didn't speak with words. It projected a single, overwhelming human concept. Apologize. But a simple "I'm sorry" wouldn't suffice for a species that had just lost 3 billion lives to alien hubris. The apology required a rebalancing of the scales. The silence on the bridge of the Relentless was no longer the heavy, suffocating weight of a nightmare. It was the sharp, clinical silence of a courtroom. Admiral Marcus Webb stood at his full height, smoothing the front of his dress uniform with a slow, deliberate motion that made Commander Vorath's remaining sensory stalks twitch in terror. The iridescent dragon and the towering titans had vanished, pulled back into the depths of the Admiral's mind, but the atmosphere remained charged with the static of a god who had just decided to stop playing. "Commander Vorath," the Admiral said, his voice now crisp, clear, and terrifyingly human. "You've spent the last few hours inside my head. You've seen our history, our scars, and the things we keep in the dark to ensure we can be polite during the day. I believe you understand now that our Annoyance protocol is not a suggestion. It is a safety valve. For you." Vorath looked at his own hands. They were no longer fading, but they felt heavy, as if the gravity of the human ship had permanently altered his mass. On the view screen, the Kravathi homeworld was no longer shrouded in darkness. Instead, it was surrounded by thousands of human reliquary ships, vessels that hadn't appeared on any scanner until the moment the Admiral opened his eyes. These were not warships in the traditional sense. They were reality anchors, capable of holding an entire star system in a state of physical suspension. "The bill is simple," Webb continued, pacing the bridge as Lieutenant Jackson and the rest of the crew began to stir, waking up with the synchronized precision of an apex predator pack. "First, the Kravathi hegemony will withdraw from all contested sectors, including New Perth and the Oort Cloud outposts. You will leave the infrastructure intact. Consider it a late payment fee for the 3 billion lives your clinical reports deemed acceptable casualties." High Counselor Ixal's face appeared on the main holographic display. He looked aged, his bioluminescence dim and flickering like a dying candle. He didn't argue. He didn't negotiate. He had felt the human noise shatter his empire's hive mind, and he knew that another 5 minutes of that dream would have turned his civilization into a collection of screaming lunatics. We accept," Zal croaked, his voice. "What else?" "Second," Webb's eyes narrowed, reflecting the cold light of distant suns. "Humanity is no longer the back row species. We are the gardeners. From this day forward, any species that initiates unprovoked biological or psychic warfare against another will answer to us. Not to your council, not to your laws, but to the things that live in our dreams. We've spent 4 billion years learning how to contain our monsters. Don't make us share them again." The Admiral gestured to Lieutenant Jackson, who tapped a command into her console. The reality anchors around the Kravathi capital began to pulse, sending a wave of golden light across the planet's surface. It wasn't a weapon, it was a signature. a permanent mark in the planet's magnetic field that would remind every Kravathi citizen for the next 10,000 years exactly what happens when you wake the silent species. The hegemony is dismissed, Webb said, turning his back to the screen. Commander Vorath, your shuttle is waiting in the bay. Please take your Shadowborn with you. And Commander, tell the rest of the galaxy that the quiet zone is officially closed. We're awake now, and we've decided we don't like the way you've been running the neighborhood. As Vorath stumbled toward the airlock, he looked back one last time. He saw the human crew, those primitive biological accidents, working with a terrifying, calm efficiency. They weren't celebrating. They weren't gloating. They were simply preparing for the next task. The galaxy had spent eons fearing the dark, never realizing that the dark was just a blanket humanity had used to keep the rest of the universe from seeing what they were truly capable of. The Relentless turned, its engines igniting with a flare of white-hot fusion, and vanished into warp. Behind it, the Kravathi Empire began the long, painful process of learning how to live in a universe where the most dangerous predators were the ones who offered you a smile and a cup of coffee. The message that pulsed through the Relentless didn't just appear on a screen. It resonated within the very DNA of every human on board. It was a frequency that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the human noise, that chaotic, dreaming core that had just dismantled the Kravathi Empire. Admiral Marcus Webb stood frozen, his eyes, once sharp with the cold pragmatism of a soldier, now wide with a realization that spanned eons. About time, brother. The voice wasn't alien. It didn't have the clicking mandibles of the Kravathi or the telepathic hum of the Ethel. It was human. But it was a version of human that sounded like it had been tempered in the heart of 1,000 suns and refined by the silence of the void for 10 billion years. Admiral, the signal. It's coming from the Great Barrier, Lieutenant Jackson whispered, her hands trembling as she analyzed the data. It's not a broadcast, it's an unlocking mechanism. The quiet zone wasn't just a shield to keep the galaxy out of Sol. It was a lock to keep us inside until we were ready. The view screen of the Relentless didn't just show space anymore, it peeled back like a curtain, revealing the subspace archives. Behind the physical reality of stars and planets lay a layer of existence made of pure consciousness. The same dream stuff the Admiral had used to break the Kravathi. Across the galaxy, the titans and dragons that had manifested from human nightmares began to transform. They weren't monsters. They were protocol guardians. Dormant code waiting for the species to reach the Annoyance threshold, required to trigger the next stage of evolution. You see, Marcus, the ancient voice spoke again, as a massive, ethereal silhouette materialized in the center of the bridge. It looked like a man, but its skin was a tapestry of constellations. Earth was never just a planet. It was a nursery. We are the Firstborn. We left you behind to see if a species born in total chaos, a species that had to dream to survive the darkness, could actually handle the responsibility of the light. The Kravathi High Council, watching through their shattered surveillance feeds, could only stare in silent, paralyzed awe. They had thought humans were a primitive bioglitch. They realized now that the rest of the galaxy were merely the unintended side effects of an experiment. Humans were the second batch, the ones designed to be the guardians because they knew what it was like to suffer, to bleed, and to fear the dark. The Kravathi were the final test, the Firstborn continued, his hand resting on the Admiral's shoulder. We needed to know if you would use your dreams to conquer or to garden. You chose the garden. You chose the bill over the slaughter. You showed mercy when you had the power of a god. Admiral Webb looked out at the galaxy, at the thousands of star systems that were now silent, waiting for humanity's next word. He realized the Annoyance protocol was over. The patient stage was finished. What happens now? Webb asked, his voice steady once more. Now. The Firstborn smiled, and for the first time the entire galaxy felt a sensation of warmth and peace that hadn't existed since the dawn of time. The nursery door is open. The galaxy is loud, chaotic, and very, very broken. It needs a species that knows how to fix things. It needs a species that isn't afraid to close its eyes and see a better world. On the bridge of the Relentless, the crew didn't cheer. They simply went back to their stations. There was work to be done. 1,000 wars to de-escalate. 1,000,000 worlds to teach. And for the first time in 4 billion years, humanity wasn't just getting by. They were stepping into the role they were always meant to play. The human noise wasn't a curse. It was the song of the universe's new conductors. And as the Relentless set a course for the center of the Galactic Council, the stars themselves seemed to align, marking the path for the species that had finally, at long last, woken up for good.